There are wrongful arrest cases that begin with a violent crime. There are others that begin with a dangerous suspect fleeing police. But every so often, a case emerges that forces us to ask a far more unsettling question. Can an ordinary purchase become the starting point of a police operation simply because someone entered the wrong information into a computer? This is the story of Coast Guard officer Shane Sprag, a man who spent years saving for his dream truck, only to find himself staring down the barrels of police rifles just 10 days after driving it off the dealership lot. And as we'll see, this case isn't just about a clerical mistake. It's about what happened after the mistake was discovered, and whether anyone involved ever stopped long enough to ask the most basic investigative question. What if the system is wrong? Because by the end of this case, one thing becomes painfully clear. The biggest failure wasn't the dealership's paperwork. It was the complete collapse of investigative judgment. To understand why this incident became so controversial, we have to go back 10 days before the arrest. June 21, 2025. Shane Sprag walked into Doral Volkswagen in South Florida looking for one very specific vehicle, a GMC Sierra AT4X. This wasn't an impulse purchase. According to the lawsuit and his own statements, he'd wanted this truck for years. He had worked, saved, sacrificed, and finally accumulated enough money to make a $15,000 down payment. He test drove the truck. He loved it. The dealership inspected the vehicle he planned to trade in, a 2012 Ford Focus. Both sides negotiated a price. The truck's purchase price came to approximately $61,230. He signed the financing paperwork electronically. The dealership transferred his registration. They gave him the keys. They handed him a USB drive containing copies of every signed document. The salesperson even took the traditional congratulatory photo of Shane sitting proudly inside his new truck. Minutes later, that same salesperson texted him, "Thank you for your business. Best wishes." To anyone looking from the outside, this looked like thousands of completely routine vehicle sales happening across America every single day. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing that should ever evolve into a criminal investigation. For the next 10 days, Shane drove the truck normally. He drove it to work. He drove it home. He drove it everywhere without a single phone call from the dealership. No one contacted him. No one claimed there was a paperwork issue. No one asked him to return. No one reported any problem with ownership. And that silence becomes incredibly important later, because if the dealership genuinely believed a customer had somehow left with the wrong truck, why wait 10 days? Why not simply call him? After all, they possessed his phone number, his home address, his financing information, his employment information, practically every detail needed to locate him peacefully. Instead, something else happened, and that decision would completely transform this story. July 1, 2025. Like countless other workdays, Shane reported for duty at the Coast Guard station. Later that afternoon, he drove to a physical therapy appointment. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. When therapy finished, he walked back toward his truck. He climbed inside. Before he could even leave the parking space, an unmarked Ford F-150 suddenly slammed directly into the rear of his vehicle. The impact wasn't accidental. It was intentional. The collision pinned his truck inside the parking space. Almost instantly, police vehicles surrounded him. Red and blue emergency lights flashed from every direction. Deputies exited with firearms already pointed toward him. Their commands were immediate. Turn around. Lift your shirt. Walk backwards. To Shane, none of this made sense. Moments earlier, he'd simply been leaving a doctor's appointment. Now strangers with rifles were treating him as though he were one of Florida's most dangerous fugitives. Notice something remarkable already. The deputies never began with questions. They never approached casually. They never attempted a traffic stop. They never requested documentation. Their very first interaction was overwhelming force. That decision deserves careful attention. Because tactical decisions often reveal what officers believe before they've verified anything. If police deploy this level of force, they're communicating one assumption: the suspect is dangerous. But what information supported that assumption? That's the first major question this case forces us to ask. In front of patients, medical staff, and random bystanders, Shane was handcuffed. His shirt was lifted to check for weapons. He placed in the back of a patrol car. Throughout the encounter, he repeatedly asked the same question: "What is going on?" The responses were strangely vague. One deputy told him, "You're not under arrest." Another explained, "You're just being detained." Another promised, "The detective will explain." Listen carefully to those statements, because this is where the legal controversy truly begins. If someone is merely detained while officers investigate, an investigation should actually be occurring. Questions, verification, collection of evidence, evaluation of competing explanations. Instead, what do we actually observe? A man in handcuffs, locked inside a police vehicle, unable to leave, his truck being searched, his property being inventoried, his vehicle being seized. He was then transported to a police station, placed inside a holding cell, moved into an interrogation room. If we ignore labels and simply examine actions, the distinction between detention and arrest becomes increasingly difficult to recognize. And that distinction matters enormously, because under the Fourth Amendment, an arrest generally requires probable cause. Not suspicion, not assumptions, probable cause. So the next question naturally becomes, what probable cause actually existed? Eventually, detectives from the Doral Police Department entered the interview room. Only then, after everything had already happened, did Shane finally learn why armed officers had surrounded him. His truck had been reported stolen. Specifically, the report originated from the dealership that had sold him the truck. At first glance, that sounds devastating. A dealership reporting one of its vehicles stolen certainly sounds serious. But investigators aren't supposed to stop at the first explanation they receive. Their responsibility is to determine whether the allegation survives even minimal scrutiny. And almost immediately, Shane began providing facts that complicated the entire narrative. He calmly explained the purchase process. He identified his salesperson. He named managers at the dealership. He described his financing. He described his $15,000 down payment. He explained the trade-in. He explained receiving registration paperwork. He explained receiving digital copies of signed contracts. He explained transferring license plates. Every answer was detailed, specific, internally consistent, not vague, not evasive, not contradictory. If detectives had encountered a genuine vehicle thief, would we reasonably expect this level of documentation? Or does this sound more like someone who simply bought a truck? That's another question worth considering. Then something even more significant happened. Shane asked for his phone. When detectives finally handed it to him, he began conducting what almost looked like the real investigation himself. He opened text messages from the dealership, messages sent by the very salesperson who sold him the truck. The detective saw them: the congratulatory photograph, the thank you message, the references to the sale, the truck itself. Everything lined up with Shane's explanation. One detective even called the salesperson directly. Think about what that means. The evidence capable of changing the direction of this investigation was sitting inside the suspect's own phone. Not hidden, not encrypted, not difficult to locate. It simply required someone willing to look, which raises another uncomfortable question. Could this entire incident have been resolved in the parking lot, before anyone pointed guns, before anyone rammed a vehicle, before anyone placed an innocent man in handcuffs? The available evidence increasingly suggests the answer may have been yes. As detectives continued reviewing records, another piece of the puzzle emerged. They discovered confusion involving the truck's registration and license plate assignment. The plate associated with Shane's paperwork did not perfectly match the vehicle investigators believed they were looking at. Eventually, the detectives themselves began acknowledging that the dealership appeared to have made a mistake. Notice the tone shift. Earlier, everyone behaved as though Shane needed to prove he wasn't a criminal. Now, officers were discussing paperwork errors, administrative confusion, possible dealership mistakes. The theory of intentional theft was quietly collapsing, not because detectives uncovered hidden evidence, but because they finally examined evidence that had existed from the beginning. That's a critical distinction. The investigation didn't suddenly become successful. It simply became delayed. Eventually, detectives confirmed Shane had legally purchased the truck. He was released. No criminal charges, no stolen vehicle case, no prosecution. But release doesn't erase what had already occurred. His truck had been rammed. He'd been publicly humiliated. He'd been searched, transported, questioned, held for hours. His vehicle had been towed. His property had been disturbed. Those events cannot simply be undone by saying, "Looks like it was a misunderstanding," because misunderstandings have consequences, especially when government force is involved. Now let's examine the investigative failures that stand out most clearly. First, the dealership reportedly possessed virtually every method of contacting Shane: phone number, address, employment information, financing records. Yet according to the allegations, no one contacted him before reporting the truck stolen. If that's accurate, why wasn't a phone call attempted first? Second, officers appear to have treated the stolen vehicle report almost as conclusive proof rather than the beginning of an investigation. But reports aren't evidence. They're allegations. Every allegation requires verification. Third, there appears to have been very little effort to reconcile obvious inconsistencies before deploying a high-risk felony stop. A Coast Guard officer, recently financed vehicle, registration documents, dealership text messages, purchase paperwork. Each one independently points toward lawful ownership. Together, they paint a picture investigators should have recognized much sooner. Finally, perhaps the most important question of all, what justified treating Shane as an armed, dangerous suspect? The available facts don't appear to suggest violence. This wasn't an armed robbery. It wasn't a carjacking. It wasn't a pursuit. It wasn't a kidnapping. It was a dealership claiming one of its vehicles had been improperly taken. Those are very different circumstances, yet the tactical response resembled an operation targeting a violent felon. Whether that escalation was legally justified remains one of the central issues surrounding this case. Following the incident, Shane filed a civil lawsuit against the dealership. The lawsuit argues that administrative failures ultimately led to his wrongful detention and humiliation, but many legal observers have raised another question. Even if the dealership made serious mistakes, does that automatically excuse every decision law enforcement made afterward? Those are separate questions. A false report, whether intentional or accidental, doesn't automatically determine how police must respond. Officers still retain independent responsibility to evaluate evidence, assess credibility, and decide whether probable cause actually exists. That's precisely why cases like this attract so much public attention, because they don't simply examine paperwork errors, they examine decision-making. In the end, this story isn't really about a truck, it's about trust. When people buy a vehicle, they trust dealerships to complete paperwork accurately. When officers receive information from third parties, the public trusts them to verify it before using force. And when mistakes happen, as they inevitably will in any human system, we trust institutions to recognize those mistakes before innocent lives are disrupted. In Shane Sprag's case, that chain of trust appears to have broken at multiple points. A dream purchase became a felony stop. A customer became a suspect. An innocent explanation was treated as an afterthought instead of the first possibility investigators considered. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire case isn't that someone entered incorrect information into a database. Databases contain errors every day. The disturbing part is what happened after those errors encountered unquestioned authority. Because once assumptions replaced investigation, the outcome was almost inevitable. And that leaves us with one final question. If Shane hadn't saved every document, kept every text message, remembered every detail of his purchase, would investigators have eventually discovered the truth on their own? Or would an innocent man have been forced to prove his innocence against a system that had already decided he was guilty? Sometimes the most revealing evidence in an investigation isn't what officers discover. It's what they never bothered to check. Imagine spending years saving for your dream truck. You finally find it. You negotiate the deal. You sign the paperwork. The dealership congratulates you. They hand you the keys, register the vehicle in your name, install your license plate, shake your hand, take smiling photos with you beside your new truck, and send you home. For most people, that's the end of the story. But for one Coast Guard officer in Florida, that was only the beginning. Because just 11 days later, multiple police vehicles would surround him. Deputies would point rifles at his head. His truck would be rammed to stop it from moving. He would be dragged out in handcuffs. And everyone around him would believe they had just captured a man driving a stolen vehicle. Except, according to every piece of evidence that would later emerge, he had legally bought that truck from the very dealership that reported it stolen. So how does something like that happen? How does a law-abiding military officer become the target of a felony stop because of a truck he purchased through completely legitimate channels? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many opportunities did everyone involved have to stop this disaster before it happened? Tonight, we're going to reconstruct this case from the beginning, not from rumors, not from headlines, but from body camera footage, interrogation recordings, internal dealership actions, police reports, and evidence that paints a very different picture than what officers believed that day. Because when you line up every event in chronological order, the mistakes become impossible to ignore. Everything began on June 20th, 2025. Shane Sprag wasn't shopping for just another pickup. He had been looking for one very specific truck, a 2024 GMC Sierra. For truck enthusiasts, that's not an ordinary vehicle. It's a premium off-road model with luxury features, advanced suspension, and a price tag exceeding $60,000. Finding the right one isn't easy. Fortunately, a friend who worked at a nearby Subaru dealership told him that Doral Volkswagen had exactly what he wanted. Better yet, the dealership's general manager personally assured him he would be taken care of. From Shane's perspective, everything looked trustworthy. Large dealership, professional staff, appointments arranged in advance. No warning signs whatsoever. The following morning he arrived at the dealership. He met with the salesman, test drove the truck, negotiated the numbers, traded in his old Ford Focus, placed a $12,000 down payment, and agreed to pay the remaining $3,000 once the initial transfer cleared. The final purchase price came to just over $61,000. Hours passed as finance paperwork was completed electronically. Eventually, the dealership finalized everything, or so everyone believed. The title paperwork was processed. Registration paperwork was completed. A new license plate was installed. The dealership handed him registration documents. Copies of the sales paperwork were placed onto a USB drive. Then, something that would later become incredibly important happened. Employees gathered around the truck. They congratulated Shane. They took photographs of him standing proudly beside his new purchase. Think about that for a second. This wasn't someone sneaking onto a lot. This wasn't someone driving away in the middle of the night. The dealership itself celebrated the sale. Employees smiled for pictures. They watched him drive away. That detail becomes critically important later, because in just over a week, those same people would tell police the truck had been stolen. Shane drove directly to show his family, like anyone would. This wasn't simply transportation. It was something he'd worked toward for years. A dream finally realized. The next morning, his bank confirmed the down payment had cleared. As promised, he contacted the dealership. The remaining $3,000 was ready, whenever they wanted it. The finance manager responded. Everything looked good. He simply needed to wait for the financing company to send setup information for his loan. Again, nothing unusual. No concerns, no missing paperwork. No phone calls saying, "Please bring the truck back." No one suggested there was any problem whatsoever. Then, days passed. Silence, no emails, no texts, no calls. From Shane's perspective, that silence meant exactly what any customer would assume. The purchase was complete. Everything had gone through. Life returned to normal. He drove the truck to work, used it every day, and never once imagined someone else believed he was driving stolen property. Then July 1st arrived. It began like every other workday. Shane reported to the U.S. Coast Guard station near Miami, completed his shift. Later that afternoon, he drove to a scheduled physical therapy appointment in Tamarac. While sitting inside the clinic, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the finance company. Exactly what he'd been expecting. "Congratulations. Welcome. Click here to set up your online loan account." Imagine receiving that text. If you're Shane, that message confirms everything. Your lender recognizes the purchase. Your financing is active. Your truck is yours. Case closed, or so he thought, because less than 1 hour later, he would walk out of that clinic into one of the most terrifying moments of his life. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, shifted into reverse. Then, without warning, a black Ford F-150 slammed directly into the back of his brand new truck. The impact threw him forward. His seatbelt locked. For a split second, he probably thought he'd just been involved in an accident. Then he looked up. Deputies, running from every direction, weapons drawn, commands being screamed simultaneously. "Hands! Get out! Walk toward us! Turn around! Put your hands behind your back!" Within seconds, the Coast Guard officer, who believed he'd simply bought his dream truck, was staring down the barrels of police rifles. No explanation, no questions, no warning, only commands and complete confusion. As officers handcuffed him, his first words weren't angry. They weren't argumentative. They weren't defensive. They were the words of someone who genuinely had no idea why his world had just collapsed. "Can you guys tell me what's going on?" No one answered. Instead, officers continued securing the scene as though they had captured a dangerous felony suspect. One deputy searched the truck. Another watched surrounding traffic. Others maintained weapons on Shane. He remained cooperative the entire time. No resistance, no attempt to flee, no aggression whatsoever. In fact, he volunteered information before anyone even asked. "I'm active duty Coast Guard." He wasn't trying to use his position as special treatment. He was trying to explain who he was, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to understand why armed officers had just rammed the truck he had legally purchased. But even then, no one told him why. Instead, deputies simply repeated that detectives would explain everything later. And that's where the first major question appears. If officers truly believed they had recovered a stolen vehicle, why didn't anyone immediately ask the most basic investigative question? "Where did you get this truck?" That single question, asked in the parking lot, might have prevented everything that followed. Instead, Shane sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, terrified, completely in the dark, while the investigation that should have happened immediately hadn't even begun. At this point in the story, something unusual begins to happen. Not unusual because a suspected stolen vehicle has been located. Police recover stolen vehicles every day. What's unusual is what happened after Shane was already in handcuffs. Because if the officers truly believed they had found the person responsible for stealing a $61,000 truck, you would expect the investigation to begin immediately. Who is he? Where did he get the truck? Does he have paperwork? Can he explain how he came into possession of it? Those are the obvious questions. Instead, almost none of them were asked. Still sitting in the back of the patrol vehicle, Shane remained remarkably calm. His breathing was heavy, his voice shook, but he never argued. He never resisted. He simply kept asking the same question. Can somebody tell me what's going on? The deputies didn't accuse him of stealing anything. They didn't tell him he was under arrest. Instead, they repeatedly gave almost identical answers. The detectives are coming. They'll explain everything. Just wait. Imagine how confusing that must have been. You're surrounded by armed deputies. Your truck has just been intentionally rammed. You've been handcuffed. Your vehicle is about to be towed away. Yet the people holding you captive won't even tell you what crime they think you've committed. One deputy eventually asked whether Shane had anyone who could pick up his truck. The question almost sounds surreal when you know what happened next. Shane answered honestly. He thought his son was at yoga. He didn't think anyone could come. Then he casually mentioned something that, looking back, becomes incredibly significant. I just got that truck. Not, I borrowed it. Not, my friend owns it. Not, I found it. His immediate explanation was exactly what an innocent buyer would naturally say. I just got it. He even mentioned that he had literally received the financing company's welcome message only minutes earlier. Again, another detail that should have triggered immediate follow-up questions. Which finance company? Which dealership? When did you buy it? Can you show us? Instead, the deputies simply continued waiting. As the minutes dragged on, Shane's anxiety became impossible to miss. At one point, he admitted something many viewers later found heartbreaking. I'm scared to death. Think about that sentence. This wasn't someone trying to manipulate officers. This wasn't someone pretending to be frightened after getting caught. This was an active duty Coast Guard officer who genuinely believed something catastrophic had happened, and he had absolutely no idea why. The officers, to their credit, tried to reassure him. They told him he wasn't currently under arrest. They described the situation as an investigation. But those words didn't match reality, because from Shane's perspective, his freedom had already disappeared. His truck was gone. He was handcuffed. He couldn't leave. He wasn't free to walk away. Whether officers called it an arrest or a detention, the experience felt exactly the same. Meanwhile, his truck wasn't simply sitting where deputies found it. It was being prepared for towing. Everything inside it stayed there. His backpack, personal belongings, electronic devices, work equipment. None of that seemed important in the moment, but it would become a massive problem later, because some of those items were directly connected to his work with the United States Coast Guard, and recovering them would become far more difficult than anyone expected. Eventually, instead of resolving the situation in the parking lot, officers transported Shane to a police station. Pause for a moment and think about the sequence of events. The alleged investigation into a stolen truck had now progressed through several major steps. A vehicle had been tracked. Deputies had conducted a felony stop. The truck had been disabled. A man had been handcuffed. The vehicle had been seized. The suspect had been transported. Yet one incredibly basic investigative steps still hadn't happened. Nobody had seriously asked Shane where the truck came from. The timeline makes this even more striking. The initial stops occurred shortly after 4:10 p.m. Body camera timestamps show that Shane wasn't brought into an interrogation room until nearly 50 minutes later. Nearly an hour had already passed. During that entire period, the central mystery remained unanswered. Who actually owned the truck? That answer could have been sitting inside Shane's phone the entire time. Finally, detectives from the Doral Police Department arrived. Unlike the deputies who conducted the stop, These detectives were responsible for investigating the dealership's stolen vehicle report. They entered the interview room, activated the recording equipment, read Shane his Miranda rights. Only then, after almost an hour in custody, did someone finally ask the question that should have been asked at the very beginning. "Tell us how you got the truck." And Shane did exactly that. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't refuse to answer. Instead, he calmly walked detectives through the entire purchase from beginning to end. He explained that he had visited Doral Volkswagen. He described test driving the truck, negotiating the deal, trading in his Ford Focus, meeting with the finance department, signing the paperwork electronically, receiving the registration, receiving the license plate, driving away with the dealership's approval. His story wasn't vague. It was detailed. Names, times, employees, departments, even the general manager's involvement. Everything flowed naturally. Nothing sounded rehearsed. The detectives listened carefully. Then they asked another important question. "Do you have the paperwork?" Shane answered yes. Most of it was at home, but there was more. He explained that the dealership had given him a USB drive containing all of the purchase documents. He also had text messages with the salesman. Immediately, the tone inside the room began to shift, because if Shane was telling the truth, this wasn't a stolen vehicle investigation anymore. It was something very different. Then detectives revealed, for the first time, why all of this had happened. The dealership had reported the truck stolen. Those words clearly stunned Shane. He looked genuinely confused, not performatively confused, not strategically confused, genuinely confused. He immediately repeated the obvious. "I bought it from them." Imagine hearing those words. The very business that sold you a vehicle had called police and claimed someone stole it. How is that even possible? That's the question everyone in that room was now trying to answer. The detectives weren't accusing Shane of lying anymore. Instead, they started asking about small details. How many keys did the dealership give you? 1. Did they mention the second key? Yes, they couldn't find it. Who handled your paperwork? Who handled financing? Who installed the license plate? Every answer pointed back to the dealership, not to some mysterious third party, not to an unknown seller. Everything originated inside Doral Volkswagen. Then another strange detail surfaced. Detectives told Shane that when they ran the license plate currently attached to the truck, their system showed something completely different. Instead of returning a GMC Sierra AT4X, it came back to a Chevrolet pickup. Even more surprisingly, that Chevrolet was apparently listed under Shane's own name. The room fell silent. Shane looked as confused as the detectives, because he had never owned that truck. At least, not the truck they were describing. And that's when this case stopped looking like a simple stolen vehicle report and started looking like a paperwork disaster waiting to explode. One wrong vehicle, one wrong VIN, one wrong entry somewhere inside the dealership's system. Could a single administrative mistake really trigger an armed police operation? At that moment, nobody in the room knew, but the answer was sitting inside Shane's phone. By the time detectives reached the halfway point of the interview, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room had completely changed. Less than an hour earlier, officers had surrounded Shane with rifles, pinned his truck with another vehicle, placed him in handcuffs, locked him in the back of a patrol car, and treated the situation like they had just recovered a stolen vehicle. Now, for the very first time, they were beginning to consider another possibility. What if the truck had never actually been stolen at all? Shane never changed his story. Not once. He didn't become defensive. He didn't contradict himself. Every answer pointed back to the same place. Doral Volkswagen. He described walking into the dealership that Saturday morning, meeting his salesperson, working directly with management, signing electronic documents, trading in his old Ford Focus, receiving registration paperwork, driving away in broad daylight. Nothing about his story sounded like someone trying to explain away possession of stolen property. In fact, it sounded almost too ordinary, because that's exactly how legitimate vehicle purchases happen every single day. Then Shane remembered something. If you let me use my phone, I can show you. For nearly an hour, the single piece of evidence most likely to answer everyone's questions had been sitting untouched. His cell phone, inside it, were text conversations with the dealership, photos, purchase information, communication with employees, potential proof that everything he had been saying was true. The detectives handed him the phone. Within seconds, the investigation began moving in an entirely different direction. The first thing Shane showed them was his conversation with the salesman. The messages weren't vague. They weren't months old. They were recent. The salesman congratulated him, discussed the truck, continued communicating after the purchase. Then Shane opened photographs taken immediately after delivery. Pictures showed the exact GMC truck, his new license plate already installed. The dealership itself had documented the delivery. Think about the significance of that. The very business claiming the truck had been stolen had photographic evidence proving they voluntarily handed it over. That alone should make anyone stop and ask, how does a dealership forget delivering a $60,000 truck? Shane then made an unexpected suggestion. Call the salesman. Simple, direct. If detectives believed he was lying, there was an easy way to verify everything. Just call the employee who sold him the truck. There was no hesitation, no attempt to stop them, no concern about what the salesman might say. Only someone confident in the truth makes that kind of offer. One detective immediately picked up the phone. He stepped outside the interview room and made the call. Inside the room, the remaining detectives kept talking with Shane, but something had noticeably changed. Their questions were no longer focused on proving guilt. Instead, they seemed focused on understanding how this situation had happened. Then came another crucial discovery. The detectives asked Shane to pull up the vehicle information connected to his financing documents. As they compared records, they noticed something strange, very strange. The vehicle information didn't line up. Certain records pointed toward a Chevrolet pickup. Others referenced the GMC AT4X Shane had actually purchased. At first glance, it looked like two completely different trucks had somehow become intertwined inside the same transaction. Nobody in the room fully understood it yet, but everyone could tell something inside the paperwork wasn't right. A few moments later, the detective who had stepped outside returned. His facial expression said almost everything before he spoke. He had just talked to the dealership, and what he learned confirmed everyone's growing suspicion. The dealership had made a mistake. Not Shane, the dealership. For the first time that afternoon, office officers openly acknowledged what was happening. One detective quietly admitted, "It sounds like they messed up." It's a remarkably understated sentence, considering everything that had already occurred. Because by this point, a man's truck had been rammed. He had been surrounded at gunpoint, handcuffed, transported to a station, held for nearly 90 minutes, placed inside an interrogation room, read his Miranda rights. All because someone apparently entered incorrect information somewhere during a vehicle sale. The mood inside the room shifted almost instantly. The detectives who had entered expecting a possible auto theft suspect were now speaking to someone who appeared to be the victim of someone else's mistake. One detective even tried to lighten the mood. "We can smile a little now." Another joked about getting coffee afterward. The comments were probably intended to reduce tension, but they also revealed something else. Everyone in that room now realized this investigation had gone terribly wrong. Shane responded with nervous humor of his own. "Just don't beat me up." It was a joke, but beneath it was a painful truth. Less than 2 hours earlier, he had genuinely believed his life might be over. Despite realizing the mistake, there was still one uncomfortable fact no one could erase. Everything that happened before this moment had already happened. No amount of laughter could undo the felony stop. No joke could erase rifles pointed at his head. No apology, if one ever came, could undo the fear of sitting handcuffed in a freezing holding cell, wondering whether your military career was about to collapse. The damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Then Shane said something that deserves attention. He thanked the detectives, not sarcastically, sincerely. He repeatedly told them he didn't blame the officers sitting across from him. As far as he was concerned, someone at the dealership had created this nightmare. That reaction tells you something about Shane's character. Many innocent people in that situation would have exploded with anger. Instead, he remained respectful, cooperative, professional, even after spending the afternoon being treated like a criminal. But while everyone inside the interrogation room now agreed, Shane hadn't stolen anything. Another problem was quietly developing outside. His truck had already been impounded. It had already been towed away. Everything inside remained locked in the vehicle. His backpack, his work equipment, personal electronics, even items connected to his duties as an active duty Coast Guard officer. The investigation might have been over, but the consequences were only beginning, because detectives had solved one mystery, only to uncover another. If Shane had legally purchased the truck, then why didn't the paperwork match the vehicle? Why was the license plate returning the wrong information? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how could an entire dealership, with managers, finance staff, inventory systems, and tracking technology, fail to realize they had sold the very truck they were reporting as stolen? The answer wouldn't come from the police station. It would come from inside Doral Volkswagen itself, from body camera footage that captured employees in real time, trying to figure out where the truck had gone, without realizing the answer had been sitting inside their own records all along. And what those cameras captured next may be the most revealing part of this entire case.